Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the first webinar of our fall 2022 Global Economic Governance Books Talk Series, hosted here by Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, or the GDP Center, as we like to call ourselves. The GDP Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment across the world. And I'm Kevin Gallagher. I'm the director of the GDP Center and a professor of global development policy here at the Pardee School for Global Studies at Boston University. In the past 30 years, the developing world has undergone tremendous changes. Poverty's fallen, people live longer and healthier lives, and economies have been transformed. Yet many countries simply have missed the boat. Why have some countries prospered while others have failed? In Gambling on Development, Why Some Countries Win and Other Countries Lose, Stefan Dercon argues that the answer lies not in some specific recipe of policies, but rather in a key developmental bargain whereby a country's elites shift from protecting their own positions to gambling on growth-based futures. Despite the imperfections of such bargains, China is among the most striking recent success stories, along with Indonesia to a certain extent, and perhaps unlikely places to many here, such as Bangladesh, Ghana, Ethiopia. Gambling on Development is about these winning efforts in contrast to countries stuck in elite bargains that lead nowhere. Building on 3 decades of experience across 40-odd countries, Dercon winds his narrative through Ebola in Sierra Leone, scandals in Malawi, beer factories in the DRC, mobile phone licenses in Mozambique, and relief programs behind enemy lines in South Sudan. Weaving together conversations with prime ministers, civil servants, and ordinary people, his book examines how development has been achieved across the world and how to assist in its success. Let me introduce you to Stefan Dercon. He's a professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and the economics department at Oxford University, although he's currently with us today in Washington, D.C. He's also the director there of the Center for the Study of African Economies. He combines his academic career with work as a policy advisor, providing strategic and economic development advice, and promoting the use of evidence in decision-making. Between 2011 and 2017, he was the chief economist at the Department of International Development, or DFID, in the UK. And between 2020 and 2022, he was development policy advisor to successive foreign secretaries at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. His research interests concern what keeps some people and countries poor, the failures of markets, governments, and politics, and mainly his work is in Africa. Before I open the discussion, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so recording is going to be immediately accessible. After Professor Dercon gives a short introduction to his book, and him and I have a short conversation about it, then we want to have a global conversation about this book. And you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen a little Q&A box. First, please put your name and your affiliation so we can try to get to know each other through this virtual environment, and then add your question. After the professor and I have a conversation about the book, we'll have a good amount of time to have a conversation with you, and I'll field some of those questions. So let's get underway. We'll have Stefan do a brief introduction and then move to an informal conversation about the book moving forward. Stefan, take it away.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you for this very kind introduction. You know, I try to write a book. You know, I'm an academic, and I've done lots of micro-level research in lots of countries for the last 30 years. But also the last 10 years, I end up in this world of policy, working in the UK, inside government, and see it from another side. And, you know, for an academic, sometimes it feels very strange what's happening in that world, but also vice versa. We don't really fully understand it. And so the book is not trying to write a pure academic book, but building on knowledge that I have from my own work, from reading, but also from just the experiences in the countries. And then, of course, the experiences, then what Kevin was referring to is this, you know, there is this tremendous change. You know, people of my age will have we go to these countries and we every time again are now shocked by the nature of change. Now, the nature of change is maybe most substantially in Asia, where we, for example, know that extreme poverty, as measured with this kind of common World Bank standard of $1.90 per day, however, whatever its weaknesses, we know that that has tremendously decreased from about 2 billion to probably only about a third of that number now. And you get the examples, you get it in China, but you also get it in other places. You get it in India more recently, Indonesia earlier, Bangladesh as an unlikely place because Henry Kissinger called it in the early 1980s a basket case. Nothing would ever happen from it. It was actually my first essay in development economics was that title. And I emphatically said, yes, it will never get anywhere. This is a country stuck forever. It has actually really remarkable improvements in living conditions, extreme poverty, health, nutrition, not least for women, but also growth in its economy of at least 6% per year for the last 15 to 20 years. So you get these kind of places that in some sense surprise. So there's differences, but even in Africa, you have places that since 1990 halved the number of extreme poverty, like Ghana and Ethiopia. You've got other places where it doubled, like the DRC, Nigeria, Madagascar. And so a lot of people, of course, also writers of books and best-selling books that you can find and that you probably should still read, have a lot of answers for that. But one of the things that I found so striking reading the literature, they always focus on what to do. This is what you do. This is how you get out of it. And they rarely ask, but how does it actually then happen? Or why doesn't it happen? Okay, and that's actually quite an important thing. And of course, there's a big strand of literature, and it's an important one that says, look, historical structural reasons will matter. Acemoglu Robinson in Why Nations Fail, a standard example there of saying, look, it's institutions. But me as a policy advisor, I'm really struck by and find it really problematic to go to a country, to go to Nigeria and talk to President Buhari and try to put these lessons into practice, because the evidence tells us that these institutions are slowly shaped through history. Am I going to tell President Buhari, when I represent the UK government, please get yourself a different history as the way of solving the kind of underlying problems? And now we also know that the countries that changed, whether it's in China, Bangladesh, or Ghana, they were not perfect when they started to change. They didn't have the perfect institutions in place. So the question becomes somehow, why do they change even in these imperfections? Now, what they did is very different. There's a broad range of policies, and most research will say there's a broad range of things. You need to do something on the macroeconomy, you need to do something on health, you need to do something on education infrastructure. If you look across the countries that have progressed in the last 3-4 decades, they did lots of different things. So it's not a narrow recipe that's there. And Michael Spence, the Nobel Prize winner, famously said as part of the Growth Commission 2008, we don't know the recipe for growth, but we tend to know the ingredients. But actually, it means there's lots of recipes that can cook for it. And actually, that's something we've definitely learned in academic work. It's quite a broad set of things that can be done. But how it is done becomes the more important issue. And indeed, why don't more countries do it? So those places that stay behind versus that did it, that's the important thing. And my thesis in the book is that underlying it is not just the structures and the history will matter, but the agency of those people with power and influence, which I call the elite, people in civil society, as well as, in civil service, in top senior positions in government, the politicians, the military, the business elite, possibly the civil society as well, and public intellectuals, the elite that shape the direction of a place. They need to have somehow an underlying shared commitment in the way they try to get moving to this. And that's something we find in common in very different ways in China, in South Korea, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, in Ghana, in Ethiopia at various periods of time. Rather than having an elite bargain that is purely focused on just serving the elite to keep the money to go around, where it's all about capturing the natural resource rents and putting it in your pockets. Maybe this is why I would think, how I would think about Nigeria or the DRC, where underlying those with power and influence don't really care, or as someone from an NGO told me, they don't give a damn about growth and development. They only give a damn about how to move the resources around and have an elite bargain that's purely distributive around the natural resources and line their own pockets. So it's that difference between you need to have somehow an underlying shared commitment that allows you to start. And of course, it's not easy, and we can talk more about it. It's not about proclaiming I want growth and development. It is about a hard struggle of keeping the elite bargain around growth and development together. It's a gamble for that elite because actually change usually undermines the status quo as well. Elites love the status quo. And actually those who move towards growth and development probably do this partly because they hope there's maybe also more rents for them and they can survive that. Often it's also pushed by quest for legitimacy, the underlying conflicts in society that push them to actually move to that and so on. And all these countries, we have lots of different difficult things were taking place around the time that they actually move towards these elite bargains for development. That finally, what does it mean for development assistance? And for what outsiders like me can do, the first thing is a lot of humility. That's the best thing we can do. We are not going to fix these places, and every time we try to do it and changing things, we actually run the risk that we make it worse. Having said that, I'm not giving up on development assistance because those places where there's inkling sense that these development bargains are emerging, we should be willing to support and shift incentives more in favor of those who want to change and sustain the change than the ones that actually want much more odious type of elite bargains of lining their own pockets. We also need to be though very aware, and that's something that I'm so struck by in my experience. We can also do harm by not recognizing that sometimes with development assistance, we allow the elites to get away with doing it actually progressively themselves. Where it's in Nigeria, where we know we have terrible health outcomes, but actually it's also the country that spends the lowest share of their budget on health, probably of all the countries in the world. And if we then want to step in, we risk embedding these elite bargains. And maybe finally an example that I had even in humanitarian aid, where I flew at some point into South Sudan, into rebel held territory when the conflict was flaring up. I was landing there and I was so struck that there were no soldiers inside, but endless NGOs were all around and with their buildings around the airstrip. We had food aid warehouses, not a single guard inside. So I went to ask the rebel commander, what do you think of the NGOs? And he said, oh, they're my friends. They've been here for 20 years. Are they really my friends? And I said, okay. And he went on and he said, well, they allow me to get on with the business of war. And then I also wonder about, what are we doing sometimes in these places? I'm not calling for us retreating from development assistance, but I want us to do it much more with our eyes wide open and thinking much more carefully through how we actually affecting elite bargains in these countries, how we allow them to get away with things, and how we actually can, as outsiders, with humility, maybe make it a bit of a better place. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that great overview here. Well, you can't really see through my screen, but I'm holding a copy of the book here. And if you look in the chat, you can order a copy and get a discount on it as well. I have to admit, you see another one of these sweeping what causes development kind of books, and when I first looked at it, I was a little skeptical, but your contribution is really refreshing, and I'd say a real exception for many of the reasons that you just talked about. This is not, folks out there, this is not a book that where some blackboard economist maps out and proves what's optimal and then looks at the real world and says, well, everyone's just stupid, or it's not something that's very simplistic like, hey, institutions matter, or it's not something that's also just super narrow and just says, well, it's all too complicated, and so I'm just going to see if this small policy works in a particular village or something, or at 30,000 feet, something like, say, the Washington Consensus, which is some sort of one-size-fits-all blueprint. This is a very nuanced, fine-grained book that is a result of a lot of academic knowledge and a lot of embeddedness into the countries. As you said, yeah, there is a general understanding of what some of the ingredients are for development. You mentioned them in the book: macroeconomic stability, investments in infrastructure, health and education, managing your natural resources prudently, creating a good investment environment for private sector growth. But that can only be done if there's this elite deal or a development bargain that you talk about. What would you say the essential prerequisites are to make a bargain happen? Is it implicitly that enough of the elites see the potential of streams of benefits that they would get through a more developmental state as outweighing what they could get in a more status quo, or is there something else going on here?
No. So well, thank you. And it's it becomes, again, if you look at the different countries, there's a number of these elements that actually tend to come together, sometimes not all of them, and sometimes more one at a time. I mean, if I look at Bangladesh, which I find a really fascinating example, and I contrast that, say, with China, what's happening there. Let me actually start with the latter, because we tend to know this a bit better in general. So in China, we clearly have a period of chaos starting in the late 1960s up to about the late 1970s. Indeed, the chaos was the Cultural Revolution, ideology above all, Mao's death then, and then this power struggle that was taking place in the Communist Party. And of course, the elite there, well, by then it was the Communist Party, but they were really under threat. And I do remember as a youngster hearing these stories, will China survive? Will they be able to continue this kind of pattern? This is not as if the way we look at it now as this clearly well-established global power. There was actually a lot of uncertainty around it. Now, what's interesting there is that how does it come about? Clearly through internal power struggle. And these reformers that want to do, it was a massive leap, a massive gamble to go from an ideology-based set of economic policies to something that basically was summed up later on by Deng Xiaoping as it doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black, as long as it catches mice. The pragmatists are totally having to come out. That's a massive leap. So how does that come about? Probably out of the threat and convincing enough of these people that actually shaped it, that actually they could actually get the upper hand in it. But early on, it was all with little steps. It was all carefully done because the elite bargain may get undermined. And it was partly in the 1980s and arguably a fairly benign environment for the things they were trying to do, with that they actually could do it and actually establish them stronger. So there it was a bit a quest of legitimacy that they actually needed to have, and then finding a way. Bangladesh, actually, one thing that's in common there is against the chaos of the 1970s. They gained independence in the Independence War, but they were hit by this cyclone soon afterwards. The combination of this new institution set up with the state, very weak to start with, and then the cyclone, famine was actually raging. It's probably the last natural resource-linked famine that we can actually say in history in the world, in fact, that we had at that scale. And then political turmoil, attempts to do centralized policy making, all children of their time in the economics, and then moving to chaos and of course total failure, because the state was actually weak. And it was really built up largely, let's put it simply, as clientelists. Those people who had supported the independence struggle were getting into the state. So there was no capability to actually do anything. So they tried this kind of state-run thing. Come by the 80s and the late, well into the 80s, there seemed to be a realization, first of all, there's a weakness there. And in fact, on the policy-making side, the government becomes less ambitious. But it also allows, for example, something unique in history, an NGO becoming probably stronger than the state in social sector delivery, BRAC, now the largest NGO in the world. Which country would ever allow an NGO to become big as that? India would not allow an NGO to become as big as that. And similarly, creating opportunities there, rather than actually taking control of these early investments in garments, just allowing these guys to actually accumulate and these investors to actually flourish. And now 3-4 million people working there. So they were self-aware enough to actually shift away. But who were they? It's really interesting. I was spending a week in Bangladesh, and everybody agrees with the thesis. And everybody argues it was at a different moment. I kept on asking, when do you think it happened? What was the moment? Now, clearly, the elite bargain will not be televised. It's not a moment where there's a signing ceremony that this is actually happening. It's somehow a confluence of sources that this actually shifts us to a different, in economics we would say, or in game theory say, a different expectations equilibrium, that actually think you're beginning to act in a slightly different way, I'm doing it as well, and actually we shift to this position where there's a stability in the elite bargain that less relies on the state there, that is fairly open of who delivers services, is fairly open on how resources are accumulated, and actually getting these confluence of sources together to actually move ahead. So there's a kind of things that happen. Now, sometimes leadership matters. In this case, leadership probably mattered, but probably by stepping back a bit. In other places, go to Ethiopia. Look, we have to say it was probably linked closely to the leader there, Meles Zenawi, the prime minister then, who was both the architect-in-chief, the communicator-in-chief, the commander-in-chief, and anything-in-chief you could imagine. But also brought together a small group of people and actually convinced those that were part in the elite bargain to actually go this route of seeking legitimacy through development. So that's much more a developmental state approach where we actually did it. Ghana, totally different. It was probably a realization of the political elite that stability in politics was a good thing coming out of the Jerry Rawlings time in the 1990s, where they were willing to buy into a constrained democracy, because the democracy constitutions forbids regional and ethnic parties. So it's a constrained democracy, and the political elite, rather than just playing the game as before and disrupting everything, were willing to play within that politics and created the one thing we needed there, political stability, to actually get the kind of development opportunities that in Ghana are ample to start to be realized. So you get confluence of forces, but not a clear moment. And a lot of places, of course, where these conditions occasionally arise, and somehow or another the opportunities are not taken. Conflict doesn't lead to development. Conflict tends to lead to more conflict. And so it makes it somehow, and the agency of the actors there that leads us to some of this progress.
I'm struck by the many of the chapters and many of the examples are among the most poorer countries of the world, and not many that are the most unequal countries of the world, say the Latin American countries. Not much of a conversation about them. And I wonder how elite bargains of the nature that you find in especially sub-Saharan African countries, would they be relatively more difficult in an unequal place, say Brazil, where there's literally two planets or two countries, right? Where the elite have bank accounts in New York and live on a totally different plane, and are elite bargains more difficult to break or to cut in places of extreme and growing inequality?
It's an excellent point. I've been very struck since the book was released, is how much traction it has in Latin America. I seem to have more book reviews in Spanish, even though I don't deal with a single Spanish-speaking country in it. And people recognize the idea of an elite bargain that actually can keep countries stuck. This kind of idea that an elite bargain emerges that actually is not one for development, but indeed for growth. And so your argument that you make is there. What I also would say to it is quite interesting. Of course, Brazil was one of the countries that Michael Spence in the Growth Commission recognized as a country that had grown for 7% for more than 30 years, up to 1980. So actually you could say Brazil is probably one of these countries where there was at some point the beginnings of something, but actually, and that is the important thing for any political scientist that wants to criticize me and should criticize me, the elite bargains are not static. The political settlements, they have to be reinvented all the time. And actually, this is probably what happens a lot in middle-income trapped countries, because they are middle-income, meaning they had their takeoff moments at some point, and then it stalled. And actually, that's the kind of interesting thing that I really want to look more in it, is that actually, at different moments of your development, you probably need new striking of a growth bargain. And actually inequality probably then makes it much harder, because the status quo is so much more attractive for the elite to stick to. And so you get actually that the failed opportunity in Latin America is actually maybe one of these features. And in fact, it's something I really want to look more into it and find a language to communicate it, because of course, people have, in working on middle income trap, not reduced it to simple economics. This is again about agency and about willingness to take on the reforms that you need to do, and the vested interest and the blocking forces that you have in these countries. And of course, with middle income, the society tends to get more complex. And it becomes always then harder to keep that together. It's again, maybe why historically it's quite amazing that countries like the US or the European countries have managed to get out of that. But if you then think of it, it probably required these big moments of change that I personally am always scared about. I don't like the idea that the First World War or the Second World War has to be that catalyst, or the deep recession to get to the New Deal in the US. But it does seem to be that it actually has to do with some of these things, which makes it quite important. Like at the moment, virtually every economy in the world is facing a deep crisis. These are moments that maybe one or two of the Latin American countries can get out of that cycle and actually begin to do something different. Am I hopeful? You can't be in development unless you're hopeful and an optimist. Am I thinking it will happen? I don't know enough about these places, but it is somehow there about getting these forces that actually say there has to be another way that doesn't necessarily get rid of the rents for those who are wealthy now, but just enlarges the cake so that actually it can be broader shared. And that's something we can't have it. May I comment for a moment on South Africa? It's a very similar case like this. If you think of the early 90s, and sometimes people may not like to hear it, what I kind of blame, but I've been talking to a lot of South Africans in the African context. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. The Gini coefficient is the highest in the world. You think of it, this is in some ways should be a very progressive government. But in the early 90s, it was so difficult to get an elite bargain that you couldn't quite get further than an elite bargain for stability. You couldn't quite get to an elite bargain for development, because the issue that what was at stake, the stability of the country, required an elite bargain between white capital and probably the trade unions. And somehow or another, quite a lot of people ended up in economic terms being excluded from it. And again, this is the challenge that successive governments in South Africa have. How can we get to that other elite bargain that actually is really setting us off to growth rather than relative stagnation with huge inequality? And, it's a really hard issue in that respect.
Well, thanks for that. By focusing so much on an elite bargain and how the elites have so much agency, are you implicitly saying that the poor don't have agency, that social movements don't have agency, that they're not really a big part of social change and development in developing countries?
Yeah. Look, we all are shaped by the way that the experience we have in the book very much was shaped with my experience in working in development agency and in being involved in it and coming as an outsider in these places. I always worried a little bit, and it's a question of humility, I always worried a bit is that we like to overstate the ability of social groups, or indeed poor groups, that they can really dislodge the elite. Now it happens, of course, historically it happened, and these things are important. But I focus on the elite to bring home this blocking power of the elite. And that's what I want to see. If you think of Arab Spring, Jim Robinson and Daron Acemoglu had a great time selling their book at the time. It was written around that time. And I remember Jim Robinson going on world tours, Middle Eastern tours, every capital. He was welcome and talking to all these activists and so on, and all saying, this is your moment. This is how you can shift everything here. And we just know what happens is that probably what happened is probably in many, many places far worse than it was before. Because again, elite capture happened. Groups made it opportunistically their kind of struggle and created far more trouble. So that's, again, the elite also has this power of capturing social movements. Those that say we should stop doing it, I think we should have a bit of humility, not least where we're sitting in London or Washington or in Boston, thinking that actually we can, by supporting civil society organizations, get that change. Now, I will qualify that. In Ghana and in Kenya, working with civil society is really been important to keep on improving the external accountability, which is essential there of the elite bargain, to keep somehow the progress in development somewhat on track. And the reason is, indeed, you have fledgling democracies, they're all problematic, but we see that, and we actually have good evidence from political science that politics becomes more outcome-based. The latest election in Kenya probably reflects this. I know that as a donor, as the UK, as a development agency, we spent endless time on transparency initiatives for civil society in Nigeria. I can tell you with sadness that it probably had zero effect. All these things get published on government websites, but unfortunately the powers that be, they don't give a damn. Whether you publish all the revenue or publish all the data that goes to health or whatever, there is a real elite bargain that doesn't really need to respond because it's powerful enough. And so we should be willing to accept that that's not an easy route, but obviously these things play a role. I mean, if I said earlier, legitimacy is often a big driver. Now, it's of course from pressure from below that someone needs to prove that they are legitimate through development, because otherwise they can just do it through military means, control and whatever. So these things matter, but don't underestimate the blocking power.
Great. Folks in the audience, I'm just going to ask them a couple more questions. So start thinking about some that you might have. And again, in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom, there's a Q&A button, so you can put your name and affiliation and ask a question. Ask a question in there. Obviously, as you know, economic development is a long run process. And so in this idea of elite bargains and gambling, I ask, what is it that can hold an elite bargain together? And to bring some of the older literature here, when all the folks are Atul Kohli, Alice Amsden, Danny Roderick, Peter Evans, all these folks, they were always asked, gosh, all the countries that were able to put together these long run development plans, many of them were autocracies. Is it a bigger gamble under a democracy to be successful?
I think it's a different type of gamble. Okay, so what the evidence tells us, definitely at levels of takeoff, the kind of mean growth rates between autocracies and democracies. So amongst countries that need to take off, so lower income countries, the mean level of performance between autocracies and democracies is broadly the same. What we do indeed have, which probably what the Amsden and so on also probably implicitly observed and probably were uncomfortable with as well, is that some of the best performers turn out to be autocracies. Although the other thing that the evidence tells us is that some of the worst performers are also autocracies. Okay, so there is a case here to be made to actually saying, look, maybe we can't have this kind of dramatic success. And in some societies, democracy may also be the catalyst of doing it. So let me qualify this. So, so Kenya and Ghana, there's just no way that you would get success through just autocracy and a developmental state. First of all, the state is built up totally clientelist, so it has to come from other forces. State-led development is not what you really have as an option. But the problem is, of course, if you don't have that state, you need to have some force that keeps accountability. And the Chinese model, for example, the developmental state, requires enormously on internal accountability to keep things on track. In fact, the Chinese system, the Chinese, if you talk to them, those who were involved in the early reforms in the early 80s, they always say they were not economic reforms, they were governance reforms. There were reforms about how we govern the economy by bringing down lower people that had the incentives, getting the incentives to deliver and bring the responsibility lower down, the targets from at a lower level. That's internal accountability. I can't see this ever happening in Ghana or in Kenya because that's not the nature of the state. But how do we then keep an elite bargain for development on track? It has to come from external accountability. And in fact, democracy is closely correlated, and the improvements in democracy is closely correlated with Kenya since 2007 containing the pressures from ethnic clientelism. And how did they do it? A constitutional reform that, forgive me to put it like this, decentralized corruption, so that it's not anymore the winner takes all in the center, but actually scales down the importance of winning the presidency. And as a result, getting it closer to the people. And you also get governors and MPs now more and more elected based on the outcomes they deliver for their people than not. So decentralizing here helps with the decentralizing of corruption, of rents capture, helps here. That's probably a really positive way that Kenya gets held to account. And we know that from Ghana, it's an important measure that we have. We have evidence there that outcomes, MPs are more elected based on outcomes now, and that actually keeps the elite bargain in check now. So you need to look for what is the learning and accountability mechanism that suits the nature of the state you have. And I think that helps us to do it. And of course, democracy has its value on its own. But I saw it in Ethiopia, that because the state historically was far more centralized and bureaucracy was actually quite meritocratic, it was probably one of the few places where a developmental state model could actually deliver something. And it did for about 15, 20 years. But at the same time, since it's not single ethnicity there's multiple nationalities, the political bargain was far weaker. And that's actually what seems to have happened. The political bargain couldn't hold, but the state had the characteristics of a developmental state. So again, we need to find a model that fits both the political reality of Ethiopia and the state capability, which again, it won't look like South Korea anymore as they were trying to do. It will have to be something different.
Well, let me quickly zoom to the present and then ask a question about the future. Unfortunately, a handful of the big success stories in the book, Bangladesh, Ghana, Ethiopia, are all in big trouble right now. They're crawling to the International Monetary Fund. Ethiopia is at the Common Framework, and they're really in distress. And a lot of their distress is due to bargains that they've made with external capital markets. Whether in all their cases it's largely private bondholders, but also China. Talk to us a little bit about the bargain that you have to make with external capital in the 21st century and the extent to which that can hold given the global capital flow cycle, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, who's to blame here? These countries had zero debt in just over a decade ago, and now now they're literally waking up in the morning saying, am I going to pay for that education bill today, or am I going to pay PIMCO? And is that a problem that the elite bargains just didn't get advised well and do their own economic thinking about global capital cycles? Or is it the International Monetary Fund hadn't helped folks think about global capital flow cycles? So that's my question about today. And then tomorrow, everyone tells us, or although we should have been doing it 20 years ago, is that we need to have a major bargain to create low carbon and climate resilient and socially inclusive economies. And what lessons does your book have for that? How is that going to be different, especially in many of the countries that you focus on that haven't contributed to the climate crisis at all? Unfortunately, they're a victim of it. So if you could touch on those two quickly, and then we'll open it up to some folks and put some questions in the Q&A box, everyone, and I'll get to them right after this.
So on the first one is that, the kind of who's to blame and so on. And of course, there is agency of the countries, but, there is a bit of blame that the international community should take here. It's very striking. And I was actually alerted about that by someone very senior in the IMF at some point, who couldn't say it personally, in this case himself, that actually, if you go back to before the crisis happening, we had a situation where the three largest recipients of concessional aid from the World Bank through IDA were Pakistan, the DRC, and Nigeria. Now, these are definitely countries. I don't talk about Pakistan, but let me put it in the category as these are not countries with a development bargain. And I definitely talk about Nigeria and the DRC. So our money went there, concessional. Which countries that were actually trying to actually do something sensible at the time, which were Rwanda, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, all in different ways. In that decade before, they all went up to 2019 to the international capital market. They are the countries now in debt distress. So we clearly made choices when the going was good to tell them, oh, you just go to the markets. And meanwhile, our good money went to actually to chase bad money. And basically the returns of these things Pakistan is now again in its 23rd IMF program, having had 22 of them failed. Okay, so you have to make choices, and we made our own choices. That does mean for some of these countries that we're trying to do something, I think there's an international responsibility here to find a way of dealing with it. And it's not simple to blame China, because they were looking for capital and China offered very low returns. Yes, not transparent in the terms, very short-term things and whatever. And we have these things. So that's the bit like the kind of where we are now. We need to be willing to call it out and see where our responsibility is. It's much harder because we do need, China is not in that sense totally responsible, but it bears some responsibility because it also could restructure and it could be a thing. So in common framework, it should be willing to act as well. And we should be also willing to do our part. And of course, the political economy of the geopolitics is absolutely a mess at the moment in that respect. So that gets tied up with it. Looking at the future, I mean, there's much more to be said, but let's say looking at the future now, that second part is, look, if you were to ask me, especially of the countries on low income at the moment, if you look at their capital, they're locking in capital. They have capital stocks that are something like 1/100 of 1/200 of what the EU has as in capital stock per capita. There's nothing locking. We're telling them, oh, if you make your wrong choices now, you'll be locked in forever. No, you'll not be locked in forever. And in fact, we should not be disingenuous by talking. It's true that there are opportunities for a low carbon economy and we should try to help them. But I thought one moment I felt was my total failure when I was asked whether it would be a good idea in South Sudan, just after the comprehensive peace agreement and the independence of the country, whether we should start a climate mitigation program in South Sudan. Okay, so that's where we then go wrong in the kind of slight hypocrisy, because and in fact, if you ask me, net zero even is not a good idea, because net zero globally is a great idea. Net zero per country is a totally unfair idea. In fact, we should be willing in our rich economies to go negative consumption emissions per capita to give space to some of the lowest income countries to still move on. That would be fair. The middle income countries where it goes very fast, we should be willing them to go on net zero production. I think that's fine. But we should be net zero consumption, and so that we create space for the others. Will we win that? No, we've lost that argument a while ago. But I do feel like it's important. Maybe a final point to make, though. This is not every country I would want to support in that same way and excessively. Countries that don't have a development bargain, that somehow are not interested in it, I think we're going to waste a lot of climate finance, just as we waste a lot of development assistance by not thinking clearly what will happen. I am not interested in giving budget support to Bolsonaro, or indeed, I would not have been interested to give in the Congo Basin to some of the regimes a lot of budget support. We need to find ways of protecting these carbon sinks. It's not going to help just to write in checks because they won't use them well. But there's other countries like the Ethiopians at the time, the Senegals, the Bangladeshis, they deserve really big flows of money. They have development bargains. Yes, they're not perfect. We should get them through both the present day of the crisis and also help them to set on that path. That's where the money will have the highest returns for a low carbon economy.
Well, thanks a lot. Let me open it up to we've got a great crowd of people here, and is our tradition, we always start with a student, and so we have Victoria Bien-Ami. She's a first-year student here at Boston University's Pardee School. She says, thanks a lot for your time. You mentioned that, quote, outsiders that seek to assist developing countries need to come in with humility and not expect to dictate change, as they could make countries worse off. How can they do that without imposing their own idea of development and cherry pick which countries they want to help? Would this not exclude those that miss the boat? That's her question. We also have a question from Karan Buwalka. It says, love the first chapters of the book. He's an engineering PhD student across the river here at MIT. Says, I wonder if you can talk about if there are counterexamples you have found to your thesis. For example, countries that had an elite bargain for development but did not develop well. Stefano Ponte, good to see you, Stefanto, says, could you articulate how your argument on elite bargains differs from some of the literature on political settlements, such as Mustak Khan and others? And the last one I'll ask is from Dr. Yan Wang, former World Bank economist, who also worked at the OECD, DAX, and China Study Group, says, what should China as a new donor or financier learn from the positive and negative lessons of all this? Do you think that Western aid agencies can learn from China's South-South development cooperations in Africa and South Asia? We'll let you take those, and if we have time, we'll do another round.
Oh, thank you very much. So the first question, you know, your diagnosis, and the point was made basically, is that we come in with our own values, with our own projection. We then want to do, we cherry pick the countries we want to work with. Look, arguably, that's what I'm trying to argue against. And I've sat in these kind of organizations, and you know, we need to take away some kind of our mindset where that we know best exactly what that recipe is of progress and what these conditions are. Of course, we shouldn't give up on our values. I understand that. And you will find it very hard sometimes support countries that actually are trying to develop and do, because they may do all kinds of other things that you really object to. And you're willing, there's nothing wrong to having these considerations. But start from the country, understand the context, try to understand what the underlying political economy, the politics and the economy, where they're actually going, how business and the politics interacts, what the blocking forces are, and see. And if you then say, I can come in here, I can support those who actually want the development and the growth, maybe that's the way to do it, and so on. You start from the country, from really well understanding, and you do it with your eyes wide open. So don't set your themes in Congress or your themes in Brussels, but actually do it much more there. If you want to support, that's the only way it will do, because ownership matters of the countries, as that term is. Of course, you have to ask yourself, of course, who owns the country? And that's the critical question, the two questions. You want ownership, and what could you do there? But secondly, who owns the country, and do you think about it? So do I have the failures as well? Look, when I was writing the book, and I started writing it, in fact, at the very beginning of COVID, the Ethiopia chapter ended better than it does now, okay? So this is an elite bargain where gamble was taking on using the economic. This was a narrow elite bargain, but you know, there were within it, you know, decent people that actually were generally committed to development. You could ask questions all kinds of the way they were trying to do it, but that's exactly the same as we should have asked questions or could have asked questions in South Korea in the 1950s and 60s. So, you know, they were doing things and they were trying to do, and there was an elite bargain where the politics was weak, because this is a country that has multiple nationalities. And as people call it, the national question was never resolved. In fact, there's only been twice peaceful transitions in Ethiopia, one historian at some point told me, since the 17th century. Okay, so it's really hard to actually get a political deal there that actually stayed. The government chose to get legitimacy for the nature of the deal through the economic progress and the development. I value that. That was a valiant attempt to do it. But the political deal was weak in the end. And after Melis's death, who was actually the great communicator of chief, keeping it together, yes, he was a bit autocratic, was very autocratic, and he was a commander of chief and everything together. But he was kept it together. Actually, it started fragmenting, and different groups started to have more attention. And in fact, the war now is between people that used to be central in that elite deal to start with. They're now fighting each other. So it fails. And somehow the economic deal couldn't keep the political deal together. So it can happen. And I think if I go to Latin America, I bet I'll find more if I start studying that more carefully. Is it similar as a political settlement? There's a lot of similarities. And of course, you know, as the UK has differed, we funded a lot of that research around effective states and so on, you know, and I was writing the checks, or at least quality controlling the checks. I learned a lot from that kind of literature. I think it's slightly different in the way that I want to emphasize that nature of an elite bargain for development, that it's not just any political settlement that we should just, it's sometimes it feels, and I'm going to get in trouble with these people now, sometimes feels a bit Banglosian. The political settlement is the only settlement that could have happened. Actually, I had a moment where I got really a bit cross-examining a PhD, where it was trying to argue that in some country, a particular political settlement was the only feasible option there. No, there's agency. There's different things that can happen. So I kind of want to actually put that agency a bit bigger in it. But I learned a lot from political settlements things. I refer to it a little bit, and maybe I should have acknowledged it more. But it is a world here of multiple equilibria, much more than somehow the single equilibrium that sometimes appear to emerge from political settlement work. There are different outcomes that are possible. And finally, China. I think China is learning a bit of humility. That's very good. You know, there's not much financing happening now. I know in Beijing, they're really thinking about it. And they really, you know, I actually was involved in a lot of work with one particular key think tank close to the State Council, as the UK, we had a dialogue with them, which was asking themselves, what can the rest of the world learn from the Chinese development model? And over the 6-7 years that we worked with them, it started from the flat pack version of development, just let the state lead, infrastructure, social, special economic zones, and all will be well. To actually, I remember to the latter phases, towards the late part of the previous decade, that people there were saying, we better understand the country a bit, because actually they don't necessarily look like China. Okay, and I think that's progress. That's what they need to learn, that actually, just as Washington had to learn that the world doesn't look like the US when you go there, Beijing has to learn that countries you meet, the politicians you meet, the economic deals and the political deals you meet, they are not like the Chinese political deal. And therefore, you just do not just do a deal with Kabila or deal with Buhari, because actually their politics is very different, and you just have to understand.
Thanks for those. Looks like we've got a little bit of time. One of the questions that we ask everybody who's part of this is if there's one policy change that you could make overnight, what would it be that would help catalyze some of these elite bargains, to use some of the language of sort of Roderick and Hausman, like what might be the biggest binding constraint here that you could unleash if you made one policy change? And we'll let you answer that question and then make any closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Like, one thing I'm trying to do in the book, as you will have noticed, like trying to rail against this idea of the single solution, this kind of big idea, the kind of thing that is so popular with people that with people that come very much out of private sector and say, give me that one big thing that I can fund and I'll change it entirely. And it's actually the interesting thing, like, and I will really not put Ricardo Hausman and other people with the growth diagnostics at all I won't want to criticize. It's really valuable. But actually, what these things don't do, you find the binding constraints, but you don't think through which is the one within the political settlement or the political conditions you could actually unlock, and what is the best constraint you could unlock that has the highest return. And actually what we need to learn to do is, when we have these kind of silver bullet type of things, so the biggest binding constraint, to actually say amongst these binding, the 4 or 5 binding constraints, which actually can we have the largest return from, given that the political settlement, the political conditions, the elite bargain, is endogenous to this as well. Because if I, for example, there are lots of countries like Russia, it was true that Jeff Sachs was probably right, that, getting these companies out of state control and privatized is really probably the big solution. Maybe they were right, but they never thought through what the political dynamics of that would be. And that actually, privatization only works if you get a regulatory thing, and also if you have a benign government that actually wants this to really work separate from government. But actually, if you don't think through what endogenously that does to the change of the political structure in that country, well, you get Vladimir Putin. And that's the kind of thing that I want to allude to, is that our economic silver bullets, our technical silver bullet, if we don't do a bit like what Rand Corporation was doing in the early 60s, not thinking through the politics, but gaming what the outcome would be once you do your activity and then take into account how other parts in society and politics will react, we'll do very bad type of advice. And I think that's probably my biggest appeal. And the thing I'm trying to work on is to actually say, so how do you think endogenously about these political things that with our economic type of great policies and silver bullets try to promote? No, actually, the first best is not attainable. The most binding constraint be unlikely. There's a reason why it's the most important binding constraint. Try to understand why it is and which of the constraints we may make the players better by actually unlocking it without getting the whole house of cards falling apart and getting in a worse situation.
Well, thanks for sharing that. We could talk forever. I recommend this book to everyone. It Another whole series of questions could be, gosh, how should we be teaching development economics given the kinds of insights that you have, because it's discussing the politics, and actually knowing anything about the history of a particular place is not on the curriculum of many development economics programs. But we can't do that. We've only got a couple more minutes here, and a big sincere thank you to Stefan for sharing his thoughts with us today, and to every one of you out there who joined the discussion. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your conversation. This talk has been recorded. It'll be on our YouTube page. And I'd also like you to welcome to join us the next one. The next fall 2022 GEGI Book Talk series is going to be on October 20th, same time, same station. It'll be with Leonce Nitikumana. He and his co-author James Boyce have a new book out on the determinants and consequences of capital flight in Africa, and we'll be talking with him about that one. If you've registered for this webinar, you're automatically registered for that one, and we hope you come. And if you'd like to receive more updates about our publications, our events, and the other things that we're doing here at the GDP Center, you can subscribe. If you go to the chat over here on the corner, you can just click on there and subscribe. So thanks to Stefan again. Thanks to all of you, and we'll see you next time, and have a great day.